Long before the mountains of western Montana were mapped by any surveyor's chain, long before a newspaper in Missoula printed the first outsider's account of what the elders had always described, and long before the word Flathead ever appeared on a treaty page, a certain people of the Bitterroot Valley preserved a tradition that troubled every man who wrote it down. In the summer of 1873, a government geologist attached to a Northern Pacific Railway survey party sat inside a Salish lodge on the Jocko Reservation and listened, for the first time set to paper in his official notebook, to an old man describe what stirred beneath the Rockies. The elder spoke of long veins of hollow stone, of chambers where the air moved on its own, of a sound the mountain made in certain seasons that was not water, not wind, and not any beast the Salish had a name for. The geologist was there to sketch coal seams and to note iron in the stream beds, not to record what he later called, in a letter to a colleague, a heathen fable he could not get out of his head. What he expected to find was a valley of hunting bands and horse pasture, useful mineral traces, and a route east for the coming railroad. What he found instead was an entire people who spoke, with the calm certainty of an accountant reading a ledger, of something moving under the stone beneath his boots. Then the sound came back into the record. More than a century later, one question remains. Were the Salish speaking of a memory old enough to belong to the last ice, or a memory of something that never left? Were the newspaper items that would follow, from the Montana Territorial Press, from small Idaho weeklies, from a Bureau of Ethnology bulletin in the 1890s, 3 separate reports of a single misperception or 3 witnesses to the same phenomenon? Or was the elder simply describing, in the only language his people had for such a thing, the ordinary trembling of a young mountain range that geology would not fully explain for another 80 years? Today, we will examine the historical records, the oral traditions of the Bitterroot Salish and their kin, and the events surrounding one of the strangest and most persistent claims to come out of the American Northwest, that something in the deep bones of the Northern Rockies was awake, and that the people of the valley had been listening to it for a very long time. The Salish were not, as generations of textbooks would insist, a scattered band of horse traders who happened to be pushed into the mountains by more powerful plains peoples. They were a large and ancient network of related nations, the Bitterroot Salish, the Pend d'Oreille, the Kalispel, and further north the Kootenai, whose oral historians could recite lineages that reached back by their own reckoning to a time before the Great Cold retreated from the high passes. Their winter camps at the foot of the Bitterroot Range were not new. Archaeologists working the Bitterroot floor in the 1960s would date hearths and stone tool workshops in the valley to more than 9,000 years before the present, and their more cautious colleagues, working sites at Lolo Pass and along the Blackfoot drainage, would push that number older still. This was not a young people in an old land. This was an old people in a land they had known through changes so deep the rest of the continent had forgotten them. Their knowledge moved by mouth. The Salish had no written script, and by the reckoning of their own elders, they had no need for one. A single practiced storyteller could recite, without error, the placement of every named spring and every named cliff along 100 miles of trail, together with the story of what had happened at each. What one might call geography and what another might call theology were, for them, one continuous field of knowledge, and the young were expected to learn the whole of it before they were considered ready to speak in council. When the elder in the Jocko Lodge described what stirred beneath the Rockies, he was not offering a personal opinion. He was reciting a piece of an inheritance, one that had been carried, by his own account, from grandfather to grandson for a length of time he estimated in generations rather than years. The tradition itself was simple, and it was strange. The Salish held that the mountain range along their western border was not solid. They held that beneath its stone lay long systems of caves and open chambers, some water-cut, some far older than water, and that these hollows had once been inhabited by a people who were not the Salish, who spoke no language any Salish could understand, and who were still, in some places, present. The elders did not describe these older ones as ghosts. They did not describe them as monsters or as spirits in the loose sense the missionaries later assumed, not as creatures out of a fireside tale, but as neighbors who had chosen the underside of the world when the surface changed, and who occasionally, at long intervals, could still be heard. Not as legend, but as a matter of continued fact. This, at least, was what the elder told the geologist in 1873, and the geologist, whose training ran to sedimentary bedding and the mapping of coal, wrote it down in the back of his notebook and closed the book and marched his crew north the next morning. What he did not know and could not have known was that within a decade, the same account in nearly identical words would begin appearing in the records of ethnographers, army surgeons and small-town newspapermen along a corridor that ran from the Bitterroot Valley in the south to the Kootenai country of the far north. The first newspaper mention, so far as any archivist has been able to trace, appeared in September of 1882 in a weekly published out of Missoula. The item was short, ran without a byline, and quoted a settler who had spent a winter with a Kalispel family along the Clark Fork. He reported that his hosts, on 2 occasions during a cold January, had risen in the middle of the night, gone silent, and stood at the door of the lodge as though listening to a distant conversation. When he asked them in the morning what they had heard, the eldest of them had said only that the mountain was speaking. He pressed for more and was told, politely and firmly, that the mountain did not speak to guests. The settler's account might have been dismissed as a lonely man's exaggeration, but 3 years later, in the spring of 1885, a Bureau of Ethnology correspondent traveling through the Flathead Reservation collected a nearly identical statement, this time from an elder of the Pound d'Oreille who had never met the settler and who lived more than 100 miles from the site of the earlier account. That elder used a phrase the correspondent transliterated as best he could, and which he translated in his report as the ones who did not come up when we did. He noted that his informant was quite specific, that these were not spirits of the recent dead, that they were not creator beings from the world's beginning, that they were another people, an older people, and that they lived, still, in the rock. Then the sound was heard for the first time by an outsider. In April of 1888, an army topographer working on the northern edge of what would later be called the Bob Marshall Wilderness reported, in a supplemental note appended to a survey he otherwise found unremarkable, that his party had been woken on 2 consecutive nights by what he described as a sustained, low vibration that seemed to come out of the ground rather than from any weather. His Salish guide, an experienced man he trusted, had told him plainly that it was nothing to be afraid of, that it happened, and that it was not the season for it to be loud. When the topographer asked what was making the sound, the guide gave him a shortened version of the same story the geologist had heard 15 years earlier. The mountain was not solid. There were chambers beneath it, and those chambers were not empty. The topographer added a private note in the margin that he could not account for the vibration by any weather he had known, that no waterfall was near enough to explain it, and that his own barometer had shown no shift in air pressure that might indicate an approaching storm. He also noted, and here is where the record becomes interesting, that when he crouched with his ear to a bare patch of granite, the sound was noticeably louder, as if the stone itself were the instrument. He erased the paragraph before submitting the survey. It survives only in a personal letter to his wife, held now among the family papers of a Virginia Historical Society. What did the outsiders expect to find in these mountains? They expected timber, minerals, a route for the coming railroad, and, in the more theological camp, a heathen population in need of instruction. What they found instead were people who considered the ground beneath them a house with more rooms than they could see, and who considered themselves respectful and slightly wary of a set of neighbors none of the newcomers could name. Some researchers, working the question in later decades, would argue that the Salish and their kin were describing, in the only language available to them, the ordinary and well-documented phenomenon of low-frequency seismic vibration in a young and still uplifting mountain belt. The northern Rockies, geologically speaking, are not quiet. Small tremors, subaudible resonance, and what modern seismologists call harmonic tremor are all documented in the region. And any people living long enough in the valley might well develop a rich vocabulary for what they were hearing. Others sustained a more careful position. They pointed out that the Salish account was more specific than a description of tremor. The elders did not describe a shaking. They described a sound with pattern, a sound that came and went in seasons, a sound that could be located if one knew where to listen. And they described chambers, not seismic faults, as its source. It was, the more careful researchers argued, either a very sophisticated pre-scientific description of a physical process the outsiders were only just beginning to measure, or it was a description of something else entirely. Each source told part of the story. None of them told all of it. And then, in the summer of 1909, a small Arizona newspaper reprinted from a Montana correspondent an item that changed the weight of the question. A hunting party out of Kalispell, following an elk into a narrow drainage on the western slope of the Mission Mountains, had come across an opening in the rock. It was not a cave in the ordinary sense, no dry floor, no visible ceiling within lantern range, no clear path in. It was an opening that seemed to have been widened, at some point in a past too deep for any of them to guess, by tools. The hunters reported clean corners. They reported the marks of an edge on stone that would not otherwise have chipped that way. And when they lowered a lantern on a rope, they reported that they could hear, from somewhere far below, a sound like a bellows being worked at slow intervals. They left. They marked the drainage on a rough map. When they returned in the fall with a larger party, the opening was gone. Not blocked, not filled. Gone, in the sense that the drainage they remembered was no longer where they remembered it, and the map they had drawn no longer matched the country in front of them. Then they gave up. The item might have died there, in a reprinted column on page 6, but a Missoula physician, a man named in the reservation records only as the reservation's part-time attending doctor, wrote a letter to the newspaper the following week saying that he had spoken about the account with 2 Salish elders, and that they had both independently told him the drainage had been closed, not by human hands, not by any weather he might imagine. Closed, they said, because it should not have been open in the first place. He did not name the elders. That was a courtesy of the time, and in this case a courtesy that has cost historians a great deal of certainty. Their words survive only in his paraphrase. But his paraphrase agreed, in nearly every detail, with what the geologist had heard on the Jocko Reservation 36 years earlier, and with what the topographer had heard on the northern edge of the Bob Marshall in 1888, and with what the correspondent had recorded from the Pend d'Oreille elder in 1885. 4 sources, 4 decades, 4 different men doing 4 different jobs in 4 different corners of the same mountain country, each of them independent. Each of them telling, with small variations in vocabulary and large agreements in substance, the same story. Was it coincidence that 4 such reports converged? Was it a shared cultural rumor that a small settler population passed among themselves? Or were 4 honest men writing down, without knowing of one another, what the Salish had been saying for as long as their oral historians could recall? Some scholars argued that the settlers had heard the story from the Salish, believed it, and then interpreted their own experiences through the lens of what they had been told. Others sustained that this could not account for the earliest of the reports, the geologists, since he had recorded the tradition before he had experienced anything he could not otherwise explain, and, more importantly, that it could not account for the topographer's marginal note about the vibration being loudest against bare stone, a detail no Salish elder had ever offered to him, and which he had discovered on his own alone at 3 a.m. in April. Then the archive nearly went silent. Between 1912 and the beginning of the Second World War, the record thins to almost nothing. A brief mention in a Bureau of Ethnology field diary in 1920. A reference in an unpublished manuscript by an anthropologist working out of the University of Montana in 1932. And then, for a full decade, nothing at all. Some of the elders who had been the sources for the earlier accounts had died. The reservations had contracted, as reservations always did. The younger Salish, who might have carried the tradition forward, were being sent to boarding schools where the language of the story was forbidden. It seemed, for a generation, that whatever the Bitterroot Salish had been saying was going to be lost with them. What the outsiders expected in that generation was silence. What they found, when the record picked up again, was that the silence had never been silence at all. The tradition had simply gone inward, into homes and lodges, out of the notebooks of visiting ethnographers. It had not stopped being carried, it had only stopped being written down. This, more than anything else in the story, is the moment that historians of the tradition now consider the closest thing to a loss. Not because the memory was extinguished, it was not, but because a generation of the men and women who had heard it directly from the last of the pre-reservation elders would grow old and die without ever being asked to tell it again. What survived after them was inheritance at a further remove. Faithful, sober, careful, but a step removed from the original speakers. And it was in that thinner, later record that the story took its most disquieting turn. In 1951, a Salish woman working as a hospital aide in Ronan, Montana, agreed to be interviewed by a folklore student from the state university. She was in her 70s. Her grandfather had been, by her account, one of the elders whose testimony had been included in the 19th century Bureau of Ethnology reports, though the student was never able to confirm which one. She said something the student would remember and later publish for the rest of his professional life. She said that her grandfather had told her when she was a girl that the sound beneath the Rockies had once been louder, and that it was becoming louder again. She said he had told her that the seasons in which it could be heard were changing. She said he had told her, and this was the sentence the student underlined twice in his field notebook, that the ones who did not come up when the Salish did were beginning to move. She did not elaborate. The student did not press. But when the interview was transcribed, and when the transcription found its way into a small folklore journal in 1954, a retired mining engineer in Butte wrote to the editor with a note of his own. He said that he had worked in the 1930s on a copper prospect in the western part of the state, and that his crew had abandoned the site after hitting, at a depth his letter did not specify, what he called an open space that no core drill had predicted. He wrote that his men had refused to go back in. He wrote that one of them, a Salish labourer whose name he did not remember, had told him in 3 words that had stayed with him for 20 years, that the workers should not have opened the door. He did not offer an explanation. He said only that he had never taken another contract in the Bitterroot country. Some of the researchers who took up the question in the 1960s and 70s would argue that this second wave of reports was contaminated by the first, that once the story was in print, it inevitably shaped later testimony. Others sustained that the mining engineer in particular had no reason to invent his account, that he was writing at the end of his career, that he asked for nothing and gained nothing by writing at all, and that his letter, held now in the collections of the Montana Historical Society, is one of the more unnerving documents in the state's archive. The archaeology, for its part, refused to settle the question either way. Careful surveys of the western slopes of the Mission and Swan Ranges, conducted in the 1970s and again in the 1990s, would identify a number of openings in the rock that met, in general shape, the description in the 1909 newspaper item. None of them, however, could be conclusively identified as the drainage described by the Kalispel hunters, and none of them, when instrumented, produced any sound remotely like the one the topographer had noted more than a century earlier. Either the tradition described something real that had since gone quiet, or it described something that had never been in those particular openings in the first place. Each source told part of the story, none told all of it. And then, at the point where the case seemed to have exhausted itself, a small piece of evidence surfaced that no one had been looking for. In 2004, a graduate student in linguistics at the University of Montana, working with a Salish elder on a project to document verb structure in the language, recorded a phrase that appeared in no dictionary of Salish, then in print. The elder used it in passing, in the context of describing a place in the Mission Range where she had gone as a girl with her grandmother. The phrase, when the student later passed it with her help, did not translate cleanly into English. Its closest approximation, the student wrote in her notes, was something like the place where the underneath answers. She noted that the elder had used it without any suggestion of metaphor. She noted that the elder had used it as a proper noun. She noted that the elder had said, when asked, that her grandmother had known other such places, and that she had been told never to visit them alone. The student did not follow up. She was working on grammar, not on cosmology, and she moved on to another project. The recording sat in an archive for nearly a decade before another researcher, looking for something else entirely, listened to it and understood what she had captured. By then, the elder had died. So had the last of the elders who had heard the story directly from the pre-reservation generation. So had the physician who had written the letter in 1909. So had the mining engineer. So had the folklore student. The chain of first-hand testimony that had begun on the Jocko Reservation in 1873 was, by any strict measure, closed. And yet the archive continued to grow, not with new witnesses, but with new questions from those who had inherited the tradition. Salish scholars, now working from within their own nation, began to ask what it meant that so many independent outsiders had recorded the same account, and what it meant that the account had been treated, from the beginning, as a piece of folklore, rather than as a piece of historiography. They pointed out that when a European medieval chronicler wrote of an army marching under a strange sky, no one dismissed the chronicle as fable. When a Salish elder wrote, through the pen of a visiting geologist, of an older people in the stone beneath his valley, the account had been read as myth from the day it was set down. History is rarely resolved by a single discovery. It looks more like a puzzle with pieces missing, and the missing pieces in this case are not scattered by accident. They are missing because the men and women who held them died before the questions we now know to ask had learned how to be asked. The elders never claimed to hold every answer. What they preserved is a memory of chambers beneath the mountain, a memory of neighbors who had not come up when the Salish did, and a memory of a sound that came and went with the seasons, quieter in some years than in others, and that could still be heard by a patient ear at the right hour of the right month. If the Salish were describing the ordinary geology of a young and restless mountain range, or if they were describing something that geology has not yet found a name for, is a question each generation will have to decide for itself. What cannot be debated is that these traditions survived for centuries, long before the newspaper, long before the survey, and long before any modern investigation. The elders of the Bitterroot Valley had been listening. They had been listening, by their own reckoning, for longer than the outsiders' languages had existed to name what they were listening for. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through historical records, archaeology, and indigenous traditions, consider subscribing for more. And before you go, I'd like to know what you think. Do you believe the Salish were describing the ordinary tremor of the northern Rockies, or a memory of something older still beneath the stone? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next documentary.